Two phone calls changed everything. The first came at 8:30 on a Tuesday morning while I sat in my corner office overlooking downtown Seattle. My assistant buzzed through that a woman claiming to be my mother was sobbing on line 1. Before I could process that bombshell line, two lit up with a gruff voice, demanding to speak with Armin Peterson immediately. My father. 16 years of absolute silence, and suddenly both parents needed me desperately. Mom wailed about my sister Emma's cancer treatment, requiring immediate funds. Dad barked about my brother Jake, facing serious legal troubles that money could fix. Neither mentioned the terrified 10-year-old boy they abandoned to state care like damaged furniture. As I stared at the newspaper announcing my company's upcoming IPO, I remembered that scared child who learned what being unwanted truly meant. The memories flooded back as I listened to their desperate pleas. I was 10 years old when the divorce proceedings began, a confused kid who thought families stuck together through everything. My parents' marriage had been a battlefield of screaming matches, thrown dishes, and nights spent hiding in my bedroom closet while they tore each other apart downstairs. Emma was 12 then, already developing the sharp tongue that would serve her well. Jake was 8, quiet and observant, always watching from corners. The custody hearing was supposed to determine where we 3 kids would live. I remember sitting in that sterile courthouse hallway, swinging my legs from an oversized chair, believing we'd all stay together somewhere. The court-appointed social worker, Mrs. Patterson, kept glancing at me with this strange expression I couldn't interpret at the time. Now I understand it was pity. What I discovered later through documents I shouldn't have been able to access shattered any remaining faith in parental love. Linda and Robert Peterson had orchestrated their custody arrangements like a business transaction. Phone records showed dozens of calls between their lawyers planning exactly how to split their assets, including their children. Linda wanted Emma exclusively because, as she told her attorney, girls were easier to manage and less expensive to raise. She'd already enrolled Emma in private school and had plans for ballet lessons, piano recitals, and all the activities that would make her the perfect daughter to showcase in social circles. Emma represented status refinement and future grandchildren who might restore the family's reputation. Robert claimed Jake because he needed a son to carry the Peterson name forward. Jake was athletic, naturally gifted at baseball, and showed early signs of the mathematical aptitude that ran in Robert's family. He envisioned coaching little league games, teaching his boy to drive, and eventually passing down the family construction business that had been struggling but still held promise. Then there was me, the problem child. The one diagnosed with dyslexia who struggled to read at grade level, the boy who had panic attacks during their fights and wet the bed when stress overwhelmed my small body, the kid who asked too many questions, cried too easily, and required special education services that cost extra money and demanded extra patience. The most devastating revelation came from a recorded conversation between my parents' attorneys. Linda's voice was crystal clear. Armand has too many issues. The behavioral problems, the learning disabilities, the medical expenses. I can't handle him and Emma. She's my priority. Robert's response crushed whatever hope remained. I agree completely. The boy needs more help than either of us can provide. The state has resources for children like him. It's actually better for everyone involved. They had explicitly agreed to abandon me. Not out of desperation or financial hardship, but cold calculation. They each wanted 1 child, not 3. I was the remainder in their division problem, the leftover piece that didn't fit their new lives. Mrs. Patterson delivered the news gently, crouching down to my eye level in that courthouse hallway. Neither parent had filed for my custody. I would be placed in temporary foster care while they searched for relatives who might take me. But there were no relatives. My grandparents had passed away, aunts and uncles lived across the country with families of their own, and nobody stepped forward to claim the unwanted Peterson boy. The Williamson family became my first placement. Harold and Betty Williamson ran what amounted to a group home disguised as a loving household. They took in 4 foster children at a time, collecting monthly checks from the state while providing minimal emotional investment. Harold worked construction and came home exhausted, wanting silence and obedience. Betty managed the house like a military operation with chore schedules, strict meal times, and punishments for any deviation from their rigid rules. My first night in their spare bedroom, lying on sheets that smelled like bleach, and listening to 3 other foster kids breathing in nearby beds, I understood what it meant to be truly alone. Emma and Jake were probably settling into their new rooms, receiving hugs and reassurances from the parents who wanted them. I was learning to sleep without night lights, eat unfamiliar food, and answer to people who called me by my full name instead of the childhood nickname my family had always used. The Williamsons weren't cruel, just indifferent. They fed us, clothed us from donated items, and ensured we attended school regularly. But there was no warmth, no genuine care beyond fulfilling legal obligations. When I struggled with homework, Betty would sigh heavily and suggest I try harder. When nightmares woke me, crying, Harold would appear in the doorway and tell me to settle down before other kids complained. 6 months later, Mrs. Patterson returned with news that felt like another abandonment. No relatives had come forward. My parents had finalized their custody arrangements and were already rebuilding their lives. Linda had enrolled Emma in a prestigious private school across town. Robert had moved Jake to a house near better baseball facilities. Both children were thriving in their new environments. Nobody was coming for me. I was officially a ward of the state, a permanent foster child, whose case would be managed by overworked social workers and well-meaning but temporary families. At 10 years old, I learned that love was conditional. Family was fragile, and sometimes being unwanted was a choice adults made about children who trusted them completely. That night, I stopped waiting for rescue and started planning survival. The next 6 years taught me lessons no child should learn. Foster homes became temporary stops in a journey without destination. After the Williamsons came the Rodriguez family, who spoke primarily Spanish and expected me to adapt without assistance. Then the Hendersons, evangelical Christians who viewed my emotional struggles as spiritual failings, requiring prayer and discipline. The Johnsons lasted 3 months before deciding I was too withdrawn for their boisterous household of 6 kids. Each placement felt like audition for belonging that I consistently failed. Some families were genuinely caring, but overwhelmed by their own challenges. Others saw foster children as sources of income or charity projects that boosted their community standing. A few were barely functional themselves, struggling with addiction, financial problems, or relationship issues that made their homes unsuitable for vulnerable children. School became my sanctuary. Teachers noticed my dedication to learning, despite obvious struggles with reading and writing. Mrs. Rodriguez, my 4th grade teacher, discovered my talent for numbers and logical problem solving. She introduced me to computer programming through an after-school club that met in the library's single desktop computer. Those early programming sessions unlocked something powerful inside me. Code made sense in ways human relationships never had. Programs followed logical rules, produced predictable outcomes, and rewarded careful thinking with successful results. Unlike people, computers didn't abandon you for being different or demanding. They simply processed what you gave them and returned honest feedback. By middle school, I was spending every free moment learning programming languages, building simple games, and exploring the internet's vast educational resources. My foster families tolerated this obsession because it kept me occupied and out of trouble. Social workers noted my academic improvements, and stable behavior finally finding placements with families who appreciated studious, well-behaved children. The breakthrough came during 8th grade when I accidentally discovered my siblings' continued existence. Margaret Thompson. My foster mother at the time took me shopping for school clothes at Crossroads Mall. Margaret was different from previous placements. She fostered teenagers, exclusively specializing in kids who'd been in the system long enough to develop survival skills, but still needed guidance transitioning to adulthood. Walking past the food court, I spotted familiar faces that made my stomach drop. Emma, now 16 and stunning, in ways that would make boys stutter, sat, laughing with a group of friends. Her long brown hair was perfectly styled, her clothes obviously expensive, and her confidence radiated across the crowded space. She looked nothing like the sister I remembered, but those green eyes were unmistakably Peterson family genetics. Jake appeared moments later carrying a tray from the pizza counter. At 15, he was already tall and athletic, wearing a leather jacket from some high school sports team. His easy smile and casual swagger suggested a boy who'd never questioned his place in the world or worried about where he'd sleep at night. I approached them carefully, heart hammering with desperate hope. Maybe they'd missed me. Maybe they'd wondered where I'd gone. Maybe family bonds were stronger than I'd believed. Emma noticed me first. Her laughter died, abruptly replaced by an expression I'd never seen from her before. Cold recognition mixed with something that looked like disgust. She whispered something to her friends, who glanced at me with curious amusement. Armand. Jake's voice carried no warmth, just surprised confirmation. "What are you doing here?" The question stung worse than a slap. What was I doing here, living in my 7th foster home, wearing secondhand clothes, existing in a world they'd apparently forgotten entirely? I stumbled through an explanation about shopping with my foster mom, hoping they might ask about my life, my school, anything that showed interest in their abandoned brother. Instead, Emma stood gracefully and gathered her purse with movements that suggested our conversation was already over. "Mom said you were given away because you were too damaged to fix," she said with casual cruelty that took my breath away. "She tried really hard, but some kids just can't be helped." Jake laughed, a sound devoid of sibling affection or childhood memories. "Dad told me you were mentally defective. He said we were better off without the dead weight holding us back. Looks like he was right." They walked away without looking back, leaving me standing frozen beside the pizza counter, while strangers stared at the boy whose own family had just publicly rejected him again. Emma's friends giggled as they passed, and one of Jake's teammates made a comment about foster freaks that carried clearly across the mall's ambient noise. Margaret found me 20 minutes later, sitting alone on a bench outside the department store entrance. She didn't ask questions or demand explanations. She simply sat beside me and waited while I processed the crushing confirmation that my abandonment had been complete and intentional. That night, Margaret made hot chocolate and sat across from me at her kitchen table. She'd been a foster parent for 15 years and had seen every variety of family tragedy imaginable. Her gentle questions helped me finally tell someone the complete truth about my parents' divorce and the siblings who'd moved on without me. "Some people aren't capable of love the way children need," she said quietly. "That doesn't mean you're unlovable. It means they're limited in ways that have nothing to do with your worth." Margaret became the closest thing to family I'd ever known. She celebrated my academic achievements, encouraged my programming interests, and helped me see possibilities beyond the foster care system. When I graduated high school at 16 with a perfect 4.0 grade average and a full scholarship to MIT, she cried tears of pride that no biological parent had ever shed for me. Standing on that graduation stage, I made a promise to the 10-year-old boy who'd been abandoned by the people who should have protected him. I would build something meaningful from the wreckage they'd left behind. Success would be my revenge against their predictions of failure. I would show them what damaged could accomplish when given the chance to heal. MIT was where I learned that intelligence could overcome almost any disadvantage. My scholarship covered tuition and housing, but living expenses required creativity. I worked nights in the computer lab cleaning equipment and maintaining systems for minimum wage. Meals consisted of peanut butter sandwiches, ramen noodles, and whatever free food appeared at campus events. My roommate David Chen came from a wealthy family in California. His parents visited monthly, bringing care packages and taking him to expensive restaurants I could never afford. David was kind enough not to flaunt his advantages, but the contrast was impossible to ignore. He had fallback plans, family connections, and safety nets I couldn't imagine. While David and our classmates socialized at parties or explored Boston's entertainment districts, I spent every free moment coding. The loneliness was crushing sometimes, but programming provided escape from emotional pain. Building software required the same survival skills foster care had taught me: self-reliance, careful planning, and the ability to solve problems without expecting help. During sophomore year, I discovered a critical vulnerability in the campus network security system. Instead of exploiting it for personal gain, I documented the flaw and proposed solutions to the IT department. They were so impressed they offered me a paid position developing security protocols for the entire university system. That job led to consulting contracts with local businesses who needed help protecting their digital assets. Word spread about the MIT student who could make computer systems virtually unhackable. By junior year, I was earning more from consulting than most graduates made at entry-level positions. The real breakthrough came during a summer internship at a cybersecurity firm in Silicon Valley. I developed an algorithm that could detect intrusion attempts 67% faster than existing systems. The company offered to buy my code for $50,000, a fortune for a college student living on ramen and determination. Instead of selling, I used their offer as proof of concept and spent my senior year developing the algorithm into a comprehensive security platform. Margaret helped me incorporate as SecureNet Solutions immediately after graduation. She'd saved enough money to lend me $10,000 for initial business expenses, the first investment anyone had ever made in my potential. The early years were brutal. I lived in a studio apartment that doubled as my office, surviving on pizza and coffee while working 18-hour days. Client meetings happened in coffee shops because I couldn't afford professional office space. Every dollar earned went back into developing better software and acquiring new clients. But the business grew steadily. Small companies needed affordable cybersecurity solutions, and my platform delivered enterprise-level protection at prices they could manage. Customer referrals brought larger contracts with regional businesses that appreciated working directly with the developer instead of faceless corporate sales teams. By 25, SecureNet Solutions employed 12 people and generated $3 million in annual revenue. I'd moved into actual office space and could afford business clothes that didn't come from discount stores. More importantly, I was building something meaningful that protected businesses from the kind of predatory behavior I'd experienced as a child. The major breakthrough came when a massive data breach at a Fortune 500 company made national headlines. Their existing security had failed, catastrophically exposing millions of customer records and costing them hundreds of millions in lawsuits and remediation. 3 weeks later, their competitors began calling SecureNet Solutions. We landed contracts with 6 major corporations within 8 months. My team grew to 45 employees, and revenue jumped to $28 million annually. Tech industry publications began writing articles about the MIT dropout who revolutionized cybersecurity, though I'd actually graduated with highest honors. At 28, I was worth $50 million on paper and climbing rapidly. The IPO was scheduled for the following year, with projections suggesting the company's value could reach $800 million to $1.2 billion. Financial advisors encouraged diversification into real estate stocks and other investments that could protect wealth from market volatility. Success felt surreal after years of uncertainty. I could afford anything I wanted, travel anywhere, live however I chose. But the satisfaction was hollow without people to share it. Margaret remained my closest relationship, and I flew her to Seattle quarterly to celebrate business milestones and major holidays together. What I didn't know was that my success hadn't gone unnoticed by the family who'd discarded me. The same technology that enabled my business also made information about my achievements easily accessible to anyone who searched for my name online. Tech publications had featured my story focusing on the disadvantaged youth who overcame foster care to build a cybersecurity empire. Business journals profiled SecureNet Solutions as an example of American entrepreneurship and innovation. Local newspapers covered my charitable donations to foster care organizations and educational programs for disadvantaged children. All of these articles mentioned my background, my age, and my estimated net worth. Anyone Googling Armand Peterson would find dozens of results detailing my transformation from unwanted foster child to multi-millionaire tech entrepreneur, including the parents who'd convinced themselves they were better off without their defective son. The private investigator I hired to research my family's current situation uncovered disturbing evidence that Linda and Robert had been monitoring my success for years. Linda's computer browsed history showed regular visits to business websites featuring my interviews and company profiles. She'd printed articles about SecureNet Solutions and stored them in a folder labeled Family News. Robert had done something even more revealing. He'd bragged to business associates and neighbors about his tech genius son who was revolutionizing cybersecurity. Multiple witnesses confirmed he'd shown them newspaper clippings about my achievements while claiming credit for my entrepreneurial instincts and work ethic. Both parents had carefully tracked my financial growth while maintaining their 16-year silence. They knew exactly how much money I was making, where I lived, and what my company was worth. They'd watched me succeed from a distance, while never once attempting contact or expressing pride in my accomplishments. The investigator also revealed why they might suddenly be motivated to reconnect. Emma's life had spiraled downward after high school graduation. She'd developed a serious cocaine addiction that led to dropping out of college, losing multiple jobs, and accumulating massive debts to dealers who didn't accept payment plans. Her addiction had progressed to the point where she owed dangerous people enough money to threaten her safety. Jake's troubles were different but equally serious. His natural charm and mathematical abilities had led him into increasingly sophisticated fraud schemes. He'd started with credit card scams in college, graduated to identity theft after dropping out, and was now facing federal charges for running fake investment schemes that defrauded elderly victims out of their retirement savings. Both of my parents' chosen children had become expensive problems requiring constant financial intervention. Linda had mortgaged her house twice to pay Emma's debts and treatment costs. Robert had liquidated his retirement savings to hire lawyers for Jake's mounting legal troubles. The siblings who'd mocked me as mentally defective dead weight now represented financial burdens that were destroying their parents' stability. Meanwhile, the abandoned child they dismissed as worthless had built an empire that could solve all their problems with pocket change. The irony was devastating and satisfying in equal measure. But satisfaction turned to cold anger when I realized they'd been watching my success, while never considering that their abandoned son might want or deserve acknowledgement from the family who'd thrown him away. They'd been waiting for the right moment to return. Not out of love or regret, but calculated desperation that made me nothing more than an ATM with Peterson DNA. The phone calls that Tuesday morning were theater performances designed to manipulate emotions I no longer possessed for these people. Linda's sobbing about Emma's cancer was pure fiction, calculated to trigger guilt and immediate financial response. Robert's gruff demands about Jake's legal emergency were equally scripted, meant to sound like masculine crisis management requiring family solidarity. But I wasn't the desperate 10-year-old boy they remembered. I was 32 years old, worth $93 million, and protected by 16 years of hard-won wisdom about human nature. I let them talk while recording both conversations through security systems Margaret had insisted I install after receiving death threats from competitors. Linda's story unraveled quickly under gentle questioning. Emma didn't have cancer. She was in massive debt to dealers who'd fronted her cocaine supplies with the understanding that payment was guaranteed within 30 days. These weren't college kids selling recreational drugs. These were serious criminals who used violence to collect debts and protect their business reputations. Emma owed Marcus Rivera's organization $200,000 for drugs consumed over 8 months of escalating addiction. Rivera had initially extended credit because Emma was beautiful, charming, and came from what appeared to be a stable family background. Her mother's house provided collateral, and her brother's legitimate business suggested family resources existed to cover potential losses. But Emma's addiction had outpaced her ability to pay even minimum amounts. She'd lost her job as a dental hygienist for showing up high, lost her apartment for failing to pay rent, and moved back into Linda's house as a 30-year-old woman who needed supervision to avoid overdosing. Rivera's patience had expired along with his willingness to accept promises instead of cash. The deadline was 7 days. $200,000, or Rivera would use Emma as an example to other customers who thought drug debts were negotiable. Linda had mortgaged her house, borrowed against her retirement account, and exhausted every available credit source. She was $160,000 short, with no legal options remaining. Robert's call revealed equally desperate circumstances disguised as masculine bravado. Jake wasn't facing minor legal troubles. He was the primary target of a federal investigation into investment fraud that had defrauded 43 elderly victims out of $2.7 million in retirement savings. Jake's scheme involved cold calling seniors and convincing them to invest in fake precious metals portfolios that guaranteed 20% annual returns. He'd created elaborate websites, forged documentation, and hired accomplices to pose as satisfied customers during reference checks. The operation had run successfully for 14 months before a suspicious victim contacted the FBI. Federal prosecutors were offering plea bargains to Jake's accomplices in exchange for testimony against him as the operation's mastermind. His lawyer estimated the potential sentence at 20 years in federal prison if convicted on all charges. The only alternative was cooperating with investigators to expose other fraud networks, which would require admitting guilt and accepting 8 to 12 years incarceration. Or the family could hire the kind of defense attorneys who specialized in white-collar federal cases. Lawyers who could challenge evidence, discredit witnesses, and create reasonable doubt about Jake's leadership role in the fraud conspiracy. That level of legal representation cost exactly $200,000 in retainer fees before the trial even began. Robert had already exhausted his construction company's business accounts borrowed against equipment and property, and convinced 3 longtime employees to co-sign loans they couldn't afford. He was 68 years old with no realistic ability to earn the additional funds Jake's defense required. Both parents needed exactly $200,000 within 1 week. Both had independently calculated that their abandoned son could provide this amount without significant financial impact. Both had researched my charitable giving and concluded I was generous enough to help family members in crisis. Neither had considered that I might view their desperation as justice for the child they'd discarded when he became inconvenient. The second wave of calls came within hours. Linda tried emotional manipulation, describing Emma's terror and begging me to remember the sister who'd once protected me from our parents' fights. Except Emma had never protected me from anything. She'd actively participated in my exclusion from family activities and consistently reminded me that I was less intelligent, less attractive, and less worthy of attention than her. Robert attempted masculine solidarity, suggesting that real men protected their families regardless of past disagreements. He glossed over the abandonment as a difficult period when everyone was dealing with major changes following the divorce. In his revision of history, placing me in foster care had been a temporary arrangement that everyone understood would be resolved quickly. Neither parent apologized for the abandonment. Neither acknowledged the trauma they'd caused or expressed genuine remorse for their choices. They spoke about me like a family resource they'd temporarily misplaced and now needed to reclaim for practical purposes. The third wave revealed their coordination. Linda called claiming she'd spoken with Robert and they'd agreed I should help both siblings equally to avoid family favoritism. Robert called suggesting we split the total cost between all three children since Emma and Jake would certainly help me if our situations were reversed. They were tag teaming me with practiced manipulation techniques alternating between emotional appeals and logical arguments designed to overwhelm my defenses and force immediate compliance. The conversations felt like sophisticated sales presentations, targeting my guilt, family loyalty, and desire to be accepted by people who'd rejected me completely. But they'd made a critical miscalculation. They assumed the abandoned child still lived inside the successful adult, desperate for family approval and willing to pay any price for acceptance. They thought money could purchase the love they'd never freely given, and that financial generosity would erase 16 years of intentional absence. Instead, their desperation confirmed everything I'd suspected about their character. They were exactly the same selfish people who divided their children like property and discarded the piece that didn't fit their plans. Nothing had changed except their need for resources I possessed. The call stopped after I politely declined to commit immediate funds and suggested we meet in person to discuss the situation properly. Both parents eagerly agreed, interpreting my willingness to meet as evidence their manipulation was succeeding. They had no idea I'd spent 16 years learning to protect myself from people who viewed vulnerability as opportunity and kindness as weakness. They were about to discover that the damaged child they'd abandoned had grown into someone who understood exactly how to handle predators. The setup was more elaborate than I'd expected. Linda's third call came at 6:30 in the morning, her voice shattered with panic that sounded genuine enough to fool someone who didn't know her history of manipulation. Emma had attempted suicide during the night and was in critical condition at Harborview Medical Center. The doctors weren't sure she would survive. Linda begged me to come immediately because Emma was asking for her brother. The sister who'd called me mentally defective was supposedly dying and wanted to see me. The irony was almost laughable, but the scenario was designed to bypass rational thinking and trigger immediate emotional response. If Emma was truly dying missing, these final moments would haunt me forever. If she survived and I hadn't come, she'd know her brother had chosen money over family when everything mattered most. I drove to the hospital at 7:15 genuinely concerned despite my suspicions. Harborview specialized in trauma and emergency cases. If Emma had overdosed or attempted suicide, this would be the logical destination for ambulance transport from Linda's house. The emergency department reception area was crowded with families dealing with real medical crises. I asked for Emma Peterson and was directed to the fourth-floor conference center, not the intensive care unit or emergency treatment area. The conference center. The elevator doors opened to reveal a corporate meeting space with professional furniture, whiteboards, and a coffee service table. Linda sat at the far end with perfect makeup and clothing that suggested careful preparation rather than a panicked rush to the hospital. Robert occupied the chair beside her wearing his best suit and an expression of forced solemnity. Jake lounged against the wall in designer clothes that probably cost more than most foster children's monthly stipends. Emma stood near the windows, very much alive and completely healthy. She'd grown into the stunning woman her teenage years had promised. Her auburn hair was professionally styled, her figure maintained through expensive personal training, and her clothes probably cost more than my first car. She looked like someone who'd never missed a meal, never worried about housing, and never doubted her place in the world. Surprise! Jake said with a smirk that hadn't changed since middle school. Bet you didn't expect a family reunion. The fake medical emergency was just the opening move. They'd rented this conference space specifically for what they called an intervention, designed to address our family's communication problems and establish healthier relationship patterns. Linda had printed materials about forgiveness, second chances, and the importance of family bonds during difficult times. Emma took the lead with a performance worthy of professional theater. She apologized for the harsh words at the mall, explaining that she'd been young and confused about family dynamics she didn't fully understand. The abandonment had hurt her too, she claimed, because losing her brother had left a void in her life that success in relationships couldn't fill. She'd spent years wondering where I was, hoping I was safe, and wishing she could apologize for participating in decisions that were ultimately made by adults who should have known better. Seeing me successful and accomplished filled her with pride but also guilt about the lost years when we could have supported each other through life's challenges. The tears were perfectly timed and completely convincing. If I hadn't known about her drug debts and manipulation tactics, I might have believed her performance was genuine remorse. Jake's approach was more direct. He acknowledged that kids say cruel things during family stress periods, but insisted that sibling bonds were stronger than childhood conflicts. He was proud of my business success and wanted to rebuild the relationship we'd never really had the chance to develop properly. As adults, we could move past the confusion and hurt feelings that had kept us apart. Family was about showing up for each other during tough times, just like I was showing up now when they needed support most. Real brothers didn't keep score of past mistakes. They worked together to solve current problems and build better futures. Robert positioned himself as the patriarch, trying to reunite his scattered family. The divorce had been devastating for everyone involved, and mistakes were made by people who were overwhelmed and not thinking clearly about long-term consequences. But families could heal from even serious wounds if everyone committed to honest communication and mutual forgiveness. He was particularly proud of my achievements and wanted the chance to be the father he should have been during my formative years. Business success was meaningless without family to share it with, and he hoped we could build adult relationships based on respect and genuine affection. Linda's strategy involved maternal guilt and protective instincts. She'd made terrible mistakes during a dark period of her life when depression and anxiety had clouded her judgment about what was best for her children. Losing me had been the greatest regret of her entire life, and she'd spent 16 years wishing she could take back decisions made during emotional chaos. But families were about grace and second chances. Children forgave parents for their failures, just like parents forgave children for their mistakes. Love was stronger than hurt feelings, and she wanted the opportunity to show me the maternal support she should have provided all along. The coordinated presentation lasted 45 minutes. Each family member had obviously practiced their sections, hitting emotional triggers designed to overwhelm my defenses and force agreement through guilt, nostalgia, and desire for belonging. They painted a picture of mutual healing and restored family bonds that would benefit everyone involved. Then they revealed the true purpose behind their performance. Papers were already prepared for immediate fund transfers. Marcus Webb, their attorney, had drafted legal documents that would formalize my financial assistance as loans rather than gifts, protecting everyone's interests while ensuring prompt resolution of current emergencies. Emma's situation required immediate intervention to prevent serious consequences. Jake's legal troubles demanded swift action before federal prosecutors withdrew their plea bargaining opportunities. Delaying these decisions would put both siblings at risk while prolonging family stress that had already lasted too long. Webb presented the paperwork with practiced efficiency. $200,000 to cover Emma's debts, structured as a zero-interest loan with flexible repayment terms. $200,000 for Jake's legal defense, similarly structured to protect my interests while providing necessary family support. The documents were professionally prepared and legally binding. All I needed to do was sign authorization for electronic fund transfers, and the family's problems would be resolved within 24 hours. Emma would be safe from dangerous creditors. Jake would have proper legal representation, and our family could begin healing from years of separation and misunderstanding. They'd researched my charitable giving and knew I donated millions annually to foster care organizations and educational programs. Helping my own siblings was a natural extension of the generosity I'd already shown to strangers. $400,000 was pocket change for someone worth nearly $100 million. The manipulation was sophisticated and well executed. They'd crafted a scenario that made refusing help appear selfish, vindictive, and destructive to family relationships they were generously offering to repair. Anyone who heard their version of events would conclude I was heartless for abandoning siblings who'd reached out with genuine love and desperate need. But they'd underestimated exactly how much I'd learned about predatory behavior during 16 years of protecting myself from people who viewed kindness as weakness. I recognized every manipulation technique they employed because I'd encountered them repeatedly in foster homes, business dealings, and personal relationships. More importantly, they had no idea I'd been recording everything since their first phone calls, or that their desperation had already attracted attention from law enforcement agencies who were very interested in their financial activities and criminal associations. They were about to discover that the abandoned child had grown into someone who understood exactly how to handle people who mistook vulnerability for stupidity. I let them finish their presentation completely before responding. The silence stretched uncomfortably as they waited for gratitude, emotional surrender, or immediate compliance with their carefully orchestrated plan. Instead, I reached into my jacket pocket and placed a small recording device on the conference table. "Interesting performance," I said quietly. "But I think you should know that every conversation since your first phone calls has been recorded, including this meeting." The color drained from Emma's face first. Her practiced composure cracked as she realized her tearful apology and desperate plea had been captured for potential legal scrutiny. Jake's smirk disappeared entirely, replaced by growing panic as he calculated the implications of his own recorded statements. Linda and Robert exchanged glances that confirmed their coordination had been more extensive than they'd admitted. Webb, their attorney, immediately began gathering his papers while muttering about attorney-client privilege and unauthorized recording in private venues. "Actually, Marcus," I continued, "you should know that I've already provided copies of all recordings to FBI agent Sarah Collins, who's been investigating financial fraud schemes in the Seattle area. She found our family's situation particularly interesting. Jake was the first to understand the trap they'd walked into." His face went ashen as he processed that his own words about family loyalty and mutual support had been recorded while he was under federal investigation for defrauding elderly victims. "You're also going to be fascinated to learn that I hired private investigators 6 months ago to research my family's current activities. The reports make for compelling reading about drug debts, federal fraud charges, and coordinated attempts at extortion." Emma's tears became genuine for the first time in our adult relationship. Not tears of manipulation or performance, but real fear as she realized her careful lies had been exposed completely. Her drug dealer connections, financial desperation, and willingness to exploit family relationships for money were now documented evidence in potential criminal proceedings. The most interesting discovery was that both parents have been monitoring my business success for years while maintaining complete silence about their interest or pride in my achievements. "Linda, your browser history shows weekly visits to websites featuring interviews and company profiles. Robert, multiple witnesses confirm you've bragged to neighbors about your tech genius son while never once attempting actual contact." Both parents sat frozen as I detailed the evidence their investigators had compiled. Phone records showing coordination between their attorneys during the original custody proceedings. financial records proving they deliberately abandoned me while maintaining expensive lifestyles for their chosen children. Social media activity demonstrating they'd tracked my success while never acknowledging my existence. What really fascinated the investigators was discovering that Emma and Jake had both attempted to contact my office directly before involving their parents. My assistant logged multiple calls from people claiming to be my siblings and requesting immediate financial assistance. When those attempts failed, you convinced Linda and Robert to make emotional appeals that might succeed where direct requests had been rejected. Webb tried to interrupt with legal objections, but I continued methodically destroying their carefully constructed narrative. The federal agents were particularly interested in learning that Jake's fraud victims included several elderly residents of Linda's neighborhood. People who trusted him because his mother vouched for his character and investment expertise. Jake's knees buckled as he realized the full scope of his legal exposure. Using his mother's social connections to identify and target fraud victims was a significant aggravating factor that would increase his potential sentence substantially. Emma, your dealer connections proved equally fascinating to law enforcement. Marcus Rivera's organization has been under surveillance for 8 months. Your debt to their operation provided the leverage DEA agents needed to convince Rivera to cooperate with their investigation into his supplier network. Emma collapsed into her chair as she understood that her drug debts had made her a potential government witness against dangerous people who would view cooperation with law enforcement as the ultimate betrayal. The fake medical emergency this morning was recorded by hospital security cameras that show all 4 of you arriving together in Robert's truck. The conference room rental was charged to Linda's credit card yesterday, and your attorney's legal documents were prepared before Emma's supposed suicide attempt. The evidence of premeditated fraud was overwhelming and undeniable. They'd planned the elaborate deception specifically to manipulate my emotions and force immediate financial compliance. Every aspect of their scheme had been carefully calculated to overcome my resistance through guilt, family loyalty, and artificial time pressure. But the most compelling evidence was your own recorded statements about family relationships and financial obligations. Emma, your description of sibling bonds that transcend childhood conflicts will interest prosecutors who are charging you with conspiracy to commit fraud. Jake, your comments about family members supporting each other during tough times create interesting legal precedent for your victims' families who might pursue civil litigation. Agent Collins chose that moment to enter the conference room with 3 additional federal agents and local police officers. She'd been monitoring our meeting through security systems my company had installed throughout the building. Linda Peterson and Robert Peterson, you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud and attempted extortion. Emma Peterson, you're being detained for questioning regarding drug trafficking and money laundering. Jake Peterson, you have additional federal charges for witness intimidation and conspiracy. The handcuffs were applied efficiently, while Webb protested frantically about entrapment and illegal surveillance. But everything they'd done and said had been voluntary, recorded in locations where they had no reasonable expectation of privacy, and documented through evidence they'd created themselves. As they were led away in federal custody, Emma looked back with an expression I'd never seen from her before. Not manipulation or performance, but genuine recognition of consequences she'd never considered possible. Jake's swagger was completely gone, replaced by the terrified understanding that his schemes had finally caught up with him. Linda and Robert maintained their indignant protests about family loyalty and mutual obligation, apparently still believing their abandonment of me was justified by their current financial needs. Agent Collins remained behind to explain the broader investigation their actions had triggered. Jake's fraud scheme was connected to a larger network that targeted vulnerable seniors throughout the Pacific Northwest. Emma's drug debts had provided evidence about Rivera's organization that would help prosecute dozens of dealers and their supplier connections. My parents' attempt to manipulate family relationships for financial gain had created federal charges that carried potential sentences of 5 to 10 years each. Their coordination with Jake's fraud activities and Emma's drug connections elevated the charges to organized criminal enterprise level. The family that had abandoned me as worthless dead weight was about to discover that their rejected son had grown into someone who understood exactly how to protect himself from predators who mistook kindness for weakness. Justice was finally being served, but not in ways they'd ever imagined possible. 6 months later, I sat in the federal courthouse, watching my family face the consequences of choices that had defined their character long before their desperate reunion attempt. The courtroom was packed with victims, investigators, and media representatives covering what prosecutors called one of the most complex family fraud cases in regional history. Jake received the harshest sentence, 12 years in federal prison, for orchestrating investment fraud that had stolen retirement savings from 43 elderly victims. The judge cited his use of family connections to identify targets and his complete lack of remorse during plea negotiations as aggravating factors that warranted maximum punishment. Emma accepted a plea bargain that resulted in 4 years incarceration, followed by 5 years supervised probation and mandatory participation in drug treatment programs. Her cooperation with DEA investigators had helped dismantle Rivera's distribution network, but prosecutors emphasized that addiction didn't excuse exploiting family relationships for criminal purposes. Linda and Robert each received 2 years imprisonment, followed by 3 years probation for conspiracy charges related to their attempted extortion. The judge noted that parents who abandoned children bore special responsibility when those children achieved success despite parental neglect and abuse. But the most significant moment came when Judge Patricia Williams invited me to deliver a victim impact statement about how family abandonment had affected my development and worldview. I'd prepared extensively for this opportunity to speak publicly about experiences that shaped my understanding of love, loyalty, and personal responsibility. Your Honor, when I was 10 years old, my parents decided I was too damaged to deserve their love and too expensive to merit their care. They divided their children like furniture during divorce proceedings, choosing the pieces they wanted while discarding the one they considered defective and worthless. The courtroom was absolutely silent as I described 16 years of foster care, the siblings who'd mocked my struggles, and parents who'd monitored my success while maintaining complete emotional absence from my life. But abandonment taught me lessons about resilience that privilege never could. Foster care showed me that family is created through loyalty and commitment, not genetics and convenience. Every placement taught me something about survival. Every rejection made me stronger, and every small kindness from strangers meant more than any gesture from people who shared my DNA. I talked about Margaret Thompson, the foster mother who'd believed in my potential when nobody else would, about teachers who'd recognized intelligence despite learning disabilities, about the first clients who'd trusted their cybersecurity to a young entrepreneur with no credentials except determination and honesty. These defendants taught me that love is conditional for some people, but that doesn't make everyone unlovable. They showed me that family can be abandoned, but that doesn't make everyone disposable. Most importantly, they demonstrated that success earned through honest work is more valuable than any inheritance or family connection. The judge listened intently as I explained how their abandonment had motivated my charitable work with foster care organizations and educational programs for disadvantaged children. Every donation was inspired by memories of feeling unwanted and worthless in a society that often forgot children who didn't have advocates protecting their interests. I'm announcing today the establishment of the Thompson Foundation, named after the woman who showed me what maternal love actually looks like when it's genuine rather than convenient. This foundation will receive $10 million initially, with additional funding each year to support foster care reform, educational opportunities for abandoned children, and programs that help young adults transition successfully out of state care systems. Margaret sat in the front row, tears streaming down her 75-year-old face as I honored her influence on my development. She'd driven from Portland specifically to witness this moment, bringing the photo album she'd kept documenting my achievements from high school graduation through business success. Your Honor, these defendants gave me the greatest gift possible, though they never intended it as kindness. They taught me early that I could only rely on myself, that success required personal effort rather than family connections, and that real love had to be earned through character rather than demanded through genetics. The victim impact statement lasted 20 minutes, covering emotional territory I'd never discussed publicly before. But speaking these truths in open court with my tormentors, forced to listen, felt like closing a chapter that had defined my identity for more than 2 decades. I don't forgive them because forgiveness implies they deserve something from me that I'm choosing to withhold. Instead, I thank them for showing me exactly what kind of person I never want to become. Their choices made me stronger, more independent, and more committed to building rather than destroying. Judge Williams thanked me for my courage in sharing such personal experiences, then used my statement as the foundation for new precedents about protecting children from parental abandonment. She cited my case in establishing stricter guidelines for custody proceedings and mandating psychological evaluations for parents who attempted to surrender parental rights for non-emergency reasons. The media coverage focused on the unusual nature of family members committing fraud against their own relatives, but also highlighted the broader issues of foster care reform and support for abandoned children. Several major news outlets featured my story as an example of resilience overcoming adversity. More importantly, the Thompson Foundation's announcement generated immediate interest from other successful adults who'd survived foster care systems and wanted to contribute resources toward helping current generations of abandoned children. 3 months after the sentencing, I visited Lincoln High School in South Seattle to launch the foundation's first mentorship program. 15 teenagers in foster care had been selected to receive academic support, college preparation assistance, and career guidance from professionals who understood their unique challenges. Standing in that high school cafeteria, surrounded by kids who reminded me of my younger self, I realized that my parents' abandonment had led to something they never could have imagined. Instead of destroying my capacity for love and generosity, their rejection had expanded it beyond biological boundaries to include anyone who needed support and encouragement. The boy they discarded as worthless had grown into a man who understood that family was created through choice rather than chance. Love was demonstrated through actions rather than words. Success was measured by positive impact on others rather than personal accumulation of wealth or status. Margaret had driven down from Portland again to see the mentorship program launch. At 75, she remained actively involved in foster care advocacy and had volunteered to help coordinate foundation activities with existing social services programs. "You know," she said quietly as we watched teenagers working with their assigned mentors, "I always knew you'd do something meaningful with your life. But this exceeds even my proudest dreams about your potential." Looking around that room filled with kids who were learning they weren't disposable or defective, I understood that my parents had given me exactly what I needed to become the person I was meant to be. Not through their love and support, but through their absence and rejection. Sometimes the greatest gifts come disguised as the deepest wounds. Sometimes being unwanted is the first step toward discovering your true worth. And sometimes the family that abandons you creates space for the family you choose to build through love, loyalty, and shared commitment to something greater than yourselves. The boy who was told he was too damaged to fix had grown into a man who specialized in repairing what others had broken, including himself. That was the lesson I wanted these teenagers to understand. Being abandoned doesn't make you worthless. It makes you free to define your own value and create your own family from people who appreciate what you have to offer. As I watched 15 foster kids working with mentors who genuinely cared about their success, I felt something I'd never experienced during my childhood: the deep satisfaction of being exactly where I belonged, with people who wanted me there doing work that mattered more than any amount of money could measure. My parents had taught me the most valuable lesson possible. They'd shown me what love wasn't, which helped me recognize what love actually was when I finally found it. For that education, I was genuinely grateful. Now, I'd love to hear from you. Have you ever experienced a situation where someone from your past returned only when they needed something from you? How did you handle it, and what did it teach you about setting boundaries with people who hadn't earned the right to your help? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like to help others find it who might need to hear this message about resilience and self-worth. Subscribe for more stories about overcoming adversity and building meaningful lives despite difficult beginnings. And please share this with anyone who might benefit from understanding that being unwanted by the wrong people often means you're perfectly suited for the right ones. Thank you for listening to my journey from abandonment to empowerment. Remember that your worth isn't determined by who chooses to love you, but by how you choose to love others. Once you understand what genuine care actually looks like, keep building, keep growing, and keep believing that your best chapters are still being written.